Welcome. I'm the director of Wallace House, home to the Knight-Wallace Fellowships for Journalists and the Livingston Awards, and I would like to welcome you all to the 33rd Annual Graham Hovey Lecture. Thank you for coming. You can clap. So this is a wonderful event. It's a program honoring the second director of our esteemed fellowship, New York Times correspondent Graham Hovey. And this event, which has come to be a cherished marker of the fall for us, was started by my predecessor, Charles Eisendrath, who I will invite up to share the podium with me in a bit. And it's an event where we gather to recognize the exceptional journalistic contributions of a former Knight-Wallace Fellow whose work intersects with a pressing national issue. People love this event, as you can tell. I can assure you that this evening's lecture goes to the heart of more than one current national debate. It's a conversation that should leave us all thinking about the issues that face us nationally, our values as a country, our values as human beings, and I really look forward to the conversation. We can't do this without partners. We feel strongly about collaboration here, and I would like to thank Michigan Radio, who partners with us annually on this event. We love the contributions that you make to the community and the support you give to our program. And I'd like to thank our partners from around the university, so many faces that we see here regularly to support our work and the conversations that we're trying to start in the community. For us at Wallace House, this event also marks the beginning of the academic year when we formally introduce our new class of Knight-Wallace Fellows and invite them to unleash their journalistic curiosity to explore the vast resources of the university. We're honored to have University of Michigan President Mark Schlissel here to offer them a welcome. It's always wonderful to have the head of a university come to support our programs. That sounded catastrophic. That sounded. It's always wonderful to have the president of the university here to support us. What makes it even more wonderful for me every time he comes to one of our events is that I know through and through that Mark Schlissel is a person who believes in what we do. President Mark Schlissel understands and believes in the power of journalism and the critical role it plays in our democracy. At past Wallace House events, when he's spoken, I've often ended the event feeling that he spoke in a more impassioned way in defense of journalism's place in society than any of the reporters who happen to step up to the podium. We reporters are sometimes, we like to be nuanced in our support of what we do and don't want to be political. Thank goodness we have some people who will stand up for us. I've sent President Schlissel links to stories in the past, well-reported stories that I think should be on his radar. Inevitably, he's already seen them. He's told me, I read that last weekend. Or he's well read on the subject already. But more than being a voracious consumer of journalism, Mark Schlissel supports our values by example, by speaking out publicly on issues like equity and access and immigration, all issues that intersect with the topic we're here to discuss today. He encourages us to be bold about our own mission and vision and reach. As Wallace House has amped up its presence on campus the past couple of years, I've also often sensed President Schlissel nodding at me from the sidelines, like a good top editor who knows not to put his hands in your story, but who wants to nudge you forward. And I appreciate that greatly, because I think he's nudging me toward more ambitious work. I think he knows me well enough by now to know that I'm inclined to be bold and stir things up even without his encouragement, but the support is still certainly nice to have. And with that, I will turn the podium over to Mark Schlissel to offer our welcome.
So welcome, everybody. Thanks, Lynette, for that overly kind introduction. A special welcome to all the fellows. Welcome back, Bernice. Welcome back to campus. I remember chatting a couple of years ago when you were here for the year. A special welcome to Emilio Gutierrez Soto and his son Oscar, who are here with us for the year. Let's give them a round of applause. And it's always great to see the personification of the Knight-Wallace program and Wallace House, Charles Eisendrath and his wife are here today, so welcome back, or I guess it's not welcome back, but you've never really left. So to the fellows, I expect what appealed to you about Michigan and what you'll learn about Michigan is the same thing that appealed to me. This is now the start of my 5th year here. I have never had the privilege to work at a place with the intellectual strength and breadth of the University of Michigan. There really isn't a subject of human inquiry, of human teaching, of human interest that isn't represented at the highest levels here at this university. And you get to spend a year as kids in a candy store. I was joking with my assistant Liz that maybe when I'm done with my current job, I'll get to spend a year as a fellow in Knight-Wallace, with particularly the privilege of sitting in and participating in any class across the breadth of the campus that you'd like. And that the hidden agenda of that, of course, is our students and our fellows and our faculty get the benefit of you all, get the benefit of people that have explored the world and explored and written about human experience from many, many different perspectives. So it's truly one of the enormous win-wins of the Michigan campus. The intellectual resources here that are at your disposal, the libraries, museums, the labs, some of the world's preeminent scholars. It's really the ideal place to have access if you're a curious and inquisitive professional, which I know that all of you are. I'm sure you'll take advantage of this, and you don't even have to worry about prerequisites to get into our classes, so how cool is that? Lots to do in Ann Arbor, obviously, that I'm sure you'll come to know and love, and my personal recommendation is don't miss the corned beef Reuben at Zingerman's. We're very proud of the journalism legacy we've established here at the university, and you're now part of that legacy. I recall attending the Livingston Awards a couple of times, including my very first year here with Charles and now Lynette, to bring them our efforts to bring the Wallace House and the Knight-Wallace program ever closer to the university. You're helping the entire university understand the world better, and we really do appreciate that. I enjoy my conversation with the fellows, and I'm shilling for an invitation to come and spend an afternoon with you hearing about you and your projects in more detail, and perhaps telling you about the things I think are really important about the world of the university that the outside world doesn't really get to see often enough. I can honestly say, though, that there's never ever been a more important time for people to pursue excellence in your profession. You're actually the champion of the people. And I think that's very important to realize and to recognize. One of my own projects that I really ask your help with is I'm trying to encourage our faculty to be more engaged outside of the university. I think one of the reasons why higher education and research universities aren't held in the level of regard they used to be in our society is people really don't get to see and don't understand the value that we add to society. So I'm encouraging our faculty to be more externally engaged, more involved in civic life, lending their own expertise more to civil society, and inviting the rest of the world in, not just students and alumni, but the citizens that we're serving, the community that we're serving. And I'm sure as journalists, you can do a great job shining a bright light on what goes on inside the university. A lot of the challenges of modern society play out on our campus all the time. I'm dealing with one of them today. So I invite you to be curious and engaged. I welcome your ideas about how to get our faculty more involved in a public-facing fashion. The topic for today, this hidden voices of the Me Too movement, incredibly timely, obviously, nationally, but also very timely on our own campus. We are dealing with a challenge that all institutions are of building an environment and shaping a culture that's inclusive and equitable, where everybody has an equal opportunity to thrive. And you can't do that if you're subject to all forms of many forms of misconduct, including sexual harassment and other forms of sexual misconduct. So particularly welcome back, Bernice, to our community. I really look forward to hearing your remarks. Welcome, Knight-Wallace Fellows. I look forward to getting to know you during the course of the year. And thanks to all of you for your support of journalism in our society and its role on the Michigan campus. So thank you very much.
So now we turn to the important part of the program where we hear from our returning fellow, Bernice Yeung. So for our new fellows, the Hovey Lecture is a perfect way to mark the beginning of their time here on campus because they get to hear from someone who's done it before them. And our speaker today is 2016 Knight-Wallace Fellow Bernice Yeung, an investigative reporter with ProPublica, who was exploding conversations about systemic sexual abuse and harassment in workplace environments years before the Me Too movement started. And she forced the issue into national conversation. And while much of the spotlight around Me Too and the hashtag Time's Up, which are important catalysts for conversation right now, while much of the spotlight on those two movements has been focused on well-known celebrities and superstar corporate executives, Bernice's reporting has focused on immigrant women in low-wage work, seasonal farm workers, nighttime janitors, and domestic workers, women who risk deportation, complete loss of income, and potential violence toward their families in the U.S. and abroad if they come forward with their stories. These are some of the hardest populations to talk to about the struggles they're facing, and yet Bernice and her colleagues over several years cultivated trust and care to have countless women open up to them about horrific abuse over years and over generations and in conditions over which their abusers felt they had no control. And Bernice and her colleagues helped give them control of their stories and their advocacy and their lives. When Bernice came to the fellowship in the fall of 2015, she'd been deeply involved in investigating these women's stories for 4 years. It's probably safe to say that she arrived at the fellowship, like many reporters, exhausted and a little bit burnt out. She had won awards for her work, Rape in the Fields, and she was about to win, when she arrived, more awards for her collaboration on a project called Rape on the Night Shift. The fellowship, she told me, allowed her to step back from that intense reporting and assess what else she had to say about these issues and these struggles and these human beings that she had been so intertwined with for so many years. The result is her book, In a Day's Work, which we're selling here tonight, and which you can, if you haven't bought a copy, we'll have it available to you after the event. The result is her book, which has received critical praise for moving the conversation of sexual violence forward from merely exposing abuse to an examination of the systemic change and the new legislation necessary to better safeguard women in the most vulnerable professions. Bernice's reporting has led to legislative changes in California and Oregon, and important national advocacy on the issue, and we know that her work will continue to drive more change. When you hear journalists talk about what they would want most from their work, we use terms like civic engagement, public awareness, accountability, and most important, change. We want our reporting to get people talking about things, to move people, to ask people in power to make things better, to change what needs to be changed, to protect the people who aren't protected. And Bernice has done all of that and more over the past several years. We're so happy to have her back. Bernice's work embodies what this fellowship is about, and I'm so happy to turn over the podium to you.
Thank you, Lynette, for that generous introduction. I'm so deeply honored to be here, and I thank you in advance for your attention to what is a very difficult, but I think very critical issue. And I can't express how truly honored I am to be here giving the Hovey Lecture. It is such a tremendous honor, and I feel great pride standing in front of you because the Knight-Wallace Fellowship has been one of the most empowering and memorable experiences of my career. I remember just a few years ago when I was one of the newly minted fellows sitting in the front row. There was this kind of glorious feeling of anticipation and excitement of an adventure that was about to begin. And what I knew would make this particular adventure special was that each one of us was given the freedom and the resources to draw our own roadmaps. I didn't know it then, but the Knight-Wallace Fellowship would lead me to write my first book, which came out earlier this year. It's called In a Day's Work: The Fight to End Sexual Violence Against America's Most Vulnerable Workers. The release of the book coincided, and it was with some true serendipity, with the Me Too moment. I did not write the book in response to Me Too, but I am glad that it is part of a national conversation that seeks to tackle sexual violence head-on, that seeks to refuse the unwarranted shame that comes with speaking out about it, and that aims to look sexual violence in the eye and denounce it. Many of the cases that have received the most Me Too media attention have focused on the most high-profile among us, Hollywood stars who have been preyed upon by powerful producers, or journalists who have endured unspeakable offenses by marquee-named media personalities and executives. Each of these cases is disturbing. It's disturbing in the ways that individuals have taken advantage of professional relationships to harass and even rape. Taken collectively, they are outrageous in the way that power was exploited to diminish and harm women who were simply trying to succeed at their jobs. The women at the center of my book, based on reporting I've been doing since 2012, know firsthand how it feels to be preyed upon when all you're trying to do is earn a living. But there's one critical difference. The women featured in my book are from the working class. They are farm worker women, night shift cleaners, domestic workers. They are largely immigrant women and women of color. And they face the same kind of power imbalances as the famous and high-profile women who have come forward, except the exploitation plays out differently. These are women who don't automatically get national media attention when they call press conferences. They don't have agents and PR people to help them navigate the thicket of reporters and media outlets. Instead, for generations, they've endured and battled back extreme sexual harassment at their workplaces in a way that has largely gone unnoticed, in the very same way that they and their work largely goes unnoticed. So I'd like to take this opportunity to tell you about the women I have had the chance to meet in my reporting, who have generously and bravely shared their experiences about sexual abuse that they have faced on the job. I began looking into this problem more than 5 years ago with a group of reporters at UC Berkeley and KQED-FM, San Francisco's public radio station. We first came to this story because a journalism student at UC Berkeley came back from a summer internship with a horrific story. A woman she had met in North Carolina had told her that she used to be a farm worker. In order to keep her job every season, she was required to have sex with him. She'd become pregnant several times. As outsiders to farm work, we were startled by this story. And as journalists, we began to ask ourselves the question that drives so much reporting. Is this a terrible but isolated event? Or is this part of a larger phenomenon that requires not only public attention, but reform? We set out to answer that question. And what we found was that no matter where we went, Florida, California, Washington, Iowa, women were telling us the same thing. Supervisors and crew leads were abusing their power by demanding sex or constantly harassing their workers. Even the way in which supervisors took advantage of workers shared similarities. They looked for ways to isolate the women working for them. They ordered women into trucks under the pretense of moving them to a different part of a field or orchard. Once they were in the truck and out of earshot and eyesight of other workers, that's where the physical attacks began. One farm worker said that her rapist told her that she could go ahead and scream if she wanted to, because there was no one else around to hear her. No one familiar with the world of farm work was surprised by what we were learning, but it had gone unspoken for so many powerful reasons. First, there are the emotions that anyone who has experienced sexual violence might feel. The fear of not being believed, feelings of shame, which are unwarranted but which are real. There's the trauma that makes all of this so hard to discuss. But for so many of these women, many of whom were immigrants, there were additional challenges to speaking out. There might be language barriers. Sometimes the supervisor who was doing the harassing was also the go-to interpreter between the farm management and the workers. You can imagine that in a scenario like that, a woman's complaints of sexual harassment might get lost in translation. Many of these women Their immigration status was tenuous. Threatening to get someone deported was a common way to coerce women into unwanted sexual activity and a powerful way to keep them quiet after the fact. And then there's poverty. Farm work is incredibly difficult work, and yet it's also low paying. For many women, the prospect of losing her job was what actively stopped them from complaining about harassment and violence. Some of the women we spoke with were single mothers, responsible for providing for their children. Some of them were supporting families both here and abroad. Losing the job that was their financial lifeline was simply not something that they could contemplate. What farm worker advocates and attorneys have told me again and again is that they rarely get a woman walking through their doors to say that they have been sexually harassed. These workers only come looking for help after they've lost their jobs, been stiffed on their paychecks, and after they've suffered some kind of insult to their financial stability. As one community worker named Jesus Lopez put it, "No one comes here to say, I have been harassed. They always come here saying, I'm here because I was unjustly fired. I'm here because I didn't get my pay." Lopez says he's come to understand that when workers initially come to make a sexual harassment complaint, it's to salvage their livelihood, not necessarily to seek justice through the legal system. He says that workers knew that if they complained about the harassment, it was very likely that they could lose their jobs and not make the rent anymore. He says that he was seeing a violation of the law, but the workers were focused on resolving an economic problem. One woman that we'll call Rosa helped me understand what was at stake for speaking up. She had experienced sexual harassment at an Oregon farm where she had worked, and even worse, her sister had been raped repeatedly by a supervisor there. When we approached Rosa to ask her if she would be willing to share her family's story, she said, like so many of the women we talked to, that she would do it because she thought that talking about it could help put an end to the harassment that she saw all around her. But she came back to us with questions. How would taking such a public stance affect her job? What if the supervisor who had raped her sister found out and decided to retaliate against them? After all, she had run into him at a quinceañera recently, and he'd given her a dirty look. Before that, she had spotted him at the local Walmart. My reporting partner and I didn't have answers for Rosa, and we told her so. In fact, as reporters, we could promise her little except the possibility of protecting her identity and telling her story with fidelity. We suggested that she talk to someone who she trusted about whether she should continue to speak with us or not. And about a week later, we got word that despite her altruistic impulses, Rosa had decided not to proceed. It was a stark lesson for us. When Rosa and everyone else in her situation are asked to make it publicly known that they've been raped or otherwise sexually assaulted, the stakes for them are impossibly high. The potential collective good is weighed against what is immediately and urgently necessary. Because there are no assurances that speaking out will be met with protection from future or collateral harm, the only rational thing to do is to say nothing. After meeting Rosa, I came to understand why so many sexually abused workers have abided in silence for so long. Fear of retaliation, immigration status, poverty, those are some of the most obvious reasons that kept farm worker women like Rosa silent. And we found it was the same with night shift janitors. The demographics of workers are similar. Many janitors are also immigrant women working for small paychecks. The dynamics of the job were also the same. Just as we had found in farm work, unscrupulous supervisors used the isolation of the job as a weapon to sexually harass and assault their workers. Instead of the remote farm field, janitorial supervisors were taking advantage of the fact that they oversaw women cleaning high-rises and bank branches alone at night. They plotted out the places where there were no security cameras. Women reported being attacked in supply closets and even bathrooms. The women's reasons for not wanting to report the attacks were the same as we'd heard in farm work. Shame, trauma, language barriers, and so many fears. The fear of not being believed, the fear of deportation, and the fear of losing the job. I can't emphasize enough how much economic fragility played into what the workers felt their options were. a former janitor named Erica Morales, shows just how impossible this calculation is for many workers. In 2005, Erica was cleaning banks at night as a janitor in California's Central Valley. She worked for one of the largest janitorial companies in the country, and the only person that she came into regular contact with was her supervisor, a man named Jose Vasquez. Neither she nor the company knew it, but Vasquez was a convicted sex offender, and the company had already received complaints, including anonymous notes, that the supervisor had sexually harassed other workers. Erica was upset by the abuse she was experiencing from him, but she also told us that she had no choice but to stay on the job for a while because she was a single mother with 2 kids. She figured it would take weeks of filling out applications before she could land a new job, and she didn't know where the next paycheck would come from and how she would feed her kids in the meantime. She said that this was one of the most important reasons that she didn't immediately leave the job. She says that people had also advised her that if she just stood up to the supervisor, he'd stop harassing her. But when she tried to confront Vasquez, he only laughed at her. And she wasn't getting any other help. The supervisor above Vasquez was his cousin. The company had already received complaints about him, but had not appeared to act. Erica's experience is instructive. We are always telling workers who have been abused that they need to speak out. Employers say that they need workers to make a report so that they can become aware of a problem so they can fix it. Our system for enforcing labor laws is largely predicated on the idea that wronged workers will make a complaint. But recently, I've been talking to women who have been sexually harassed in a variety of industries, and many women say they felt like Erica did. That when she tried to say something, nothing happened, and sometimes they were retaliated against. This is backed up by decades of social science research by Louise Fitzgerald of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, Lilia Cortina here at the University of Michigan, and others, who have found that while we tend to expect women to report harassment, most workers stay silent because they don't think it'll make things better. In fact, it might even make things worse. Erica only went to the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the government entity that polices sexual harassment, after she'd quit her job and she had nothing else to lose. Thanks to her report, the government launched an investigation and eventually filed a lawsuit that included 11 more women, some of whom had reported being raped and sexually harassed by the same supervisor. After years of litigation, the company agreed to settle the case for about $6 million, and they instituted some reforms at the company. Erica's story would go on to inspire California's janitors to lead the charge against sexual harassment, which I'll talk about in a minute. But it took time, bravery, and a horrible attack for Erica to come forward. Asking someone to risk their livelihood and their future livelihood is a lot to ask of somebody who's simply trying to right a wrong and simply trying to find a way to do their job in peace. And for some workers, it's not even clear where to get help. Some workers like Mirla Baldonado can't even go to the EEOC. Mirla was a domestic worker in Chicago. Before she arrived to the United States in 2007, she was an anti-dictator activist in the Philippines, and she also did environmental activism around U.S. military base pollution. She immigrated because it became too hard to earn a living in Manila. As she puts it, it was the poverty that pushed me. She landed in Chicago, where she had some family, and through a friend, she found a job as a domestic worker. But Mirla had no experience or context for domestic work, and she had a hard time accepting the indignities that came with the job. As with farm workers and night shift janitors, sexual violence was also an open secret in domestic work. But domestic workers face an additional challenge to speaking up because federal sexual harassment law only covers companies and employers with 15 or more employees. That's a rarity for many caregivers who might be the lone worker in a household. Some states have filled in that gap, but not all. Illinois did not until 2016. What this means on a practical level is that for domestic workers in some states, there's not always a clear way to seek recourse. And yet sexual harassment was something that Mirla routinely faced on the job. Of the 30 jobs Mirla had over 6 years, she says she has experienced sexual harassment in nearly a half dozen of them. And when the National Domestic Workers Alliance conducted a first-of-its-kind survey in 2012 of more than 2,000 workers, they found problems related to verbal, physical, and sexual abuse. Echoing the concerns of night shift janitors and farm workers, few of these abused domestic workers complained because they didn't want to lose their jobs. And undocumented workers said that they worried that their immigration status would be used against them. Agricultural, janitorial, and domestic work can appear so different from the outside, but after looking at various industries that hire the most vulnerable workers, I've been forced to conclude that low-wage immigrants laboring in isolation are at unique risk of sexual harassment and assault. I can't tell you, still, how many times this happens and how often this abuse occurs. This is one of the most underreported problems out there. But I can say that these incidents are not anomalies. The federal government estimates that on average about 50 workers across all industries are sexually assaulted each day. And in the industries that hire newcomers to the country in exchange for meager paychecks, sexual assault is a known and familiar workplace hazard. But I'm not here to only talk about the problem. And what my book seeks to reveal are the ambitious efforts to find ways to prevent and combat sexual violence at work. I'll start with domestic work. Because domestic workers have been actively excluded from federal labor laws and sexual harassment protections, there's been an ongoing effort spanning nearly 2 decades to fight state by state to improve their working conditions. Sometimes these efforts take years and even as long as a decade, but various organizations, with the National Domestic Workers Alliance at the helm, have won the passage of so-called Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights in 8 states. And in a few weeks, they'll begin to push for a national version. Domestic workers have also banded together with workers at the national level to push for new laws to protect them. Earlier this year, hundreds of workers went to Washington, D.C. to ask members of Congress to ensure that all workers are covered by federal sexual harassment laws. They have also proposed new ideas for trauma-informed workplace investigations, plus confidential advocates like the ones that are available in criminal cases. And then there's the story of what's happening in the last couple of years with janitors in California. You met Erica Morales earlier, and I told you that she helped launch statewide reform. Well, here's what happened. In 2016, the Janitors Union in California watched the documentary that I helped produce, and the leadership decided that if they truly wanted to represent their members, they had to tackle sexual harassment once and for all. It's important to note that there were a number of forceful female leaders at the union, and some of them had been sexual violence survivors themselves. The union used tried and true methods like rallies and marches and speak-outs to get the issue in front of the public. They negotiated for a new union contract with policies and clauses that specifically address sexual harassment. They pushed for a new state law that requires sexual harassment training for everyone in the industry and a registration system aimed at holding cleaning companies accountable for labor violations. But simultaneously, the union did something novel, something not out of their typical playbook. The union realized that while they knew how to deal with issues like wages and physical working conditions, they weren't completely equipped to deal with issues like sexual trauma. So they turned to anti-sexual violence organizations for help. Together, these organizations, plus a group that works with non-unionized janitors, created a training and leadership program using a peer-to-peer, each one teach one model that has been successful in so many public health contexts. In Spanish, this is known as a promotora program. The program was part training, part support group, and a part leadership development. For some women, it was the first time she'd had a chance to openly discuss what sexual harassment was. And the program has had fascinating ripple effects. As the union was leading its rallies and marches and speak-outs, and as they were fighting for state legislation, their promotoras were a ready-made group of workers who could be spokespeople for the cause. But it has also led to individual and personal transformation. One of these women is a janitor named Georgina Hernandez. Georgina had 6 kids to take care of her on her own after she left her abusive husband in Mexico. She was forced to go to the United States after hitting an economic dead end at home. In the United States, she eventually found a job in janitorial work. One of her supervisors began to demand sex from her. When she rebuffed him, he threatened to fire her and deport her. He even threatened to hurt her American-born daughter, who was only a toddler at the time. He would go on to rape her 3 times. Georgina felt impossibly stuck. As she told us, there's no way to say no. When you need the job, you become the victim of others. When I first met Georgina, she could barely utter the words sexual harassment, even though so much worse had happened to her. But in the 3 years that I've known her, I've seen Georgina become a leader in this effort by California janitors to reform their industry. Georgina was among the first group of women to participate in the Promotora program, and she has told me that it has changed her. She says that now when she sees someone who needs help and looks upset, she proactively steps in. Now, she says, she knows her rights and she won't put up with unfair treatment at work. Most amazingly of all, it was through this process that she has come to accept that being raped repeatedly by her supervisor has never been her fault. Another example of powerful reform emerges from the tomato fields of Florida, where a farm worker organization called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers helped spearhead a unique sexual harassment training back in 2016. It was different and arguably more effective because it was created for farm workers by farm workers, using the vocabulary and the scenarios that they might actually encounter in the field. In other words, this wasn't a corporate training video that had been dubbed into Spanish and Haitian Creole. During the half-hour training, all of the 1,000 workers at a tomato farm were taught what sexual harassment looks like. They were also told repeatedly that there were many ways to make a complaint confidentially. Importantly, an HR rep named Angel Garcia made it clear that the purpose of the training was to change the company culture so that everyone knew that sexual harassment was not tolerated. And a critical part of that discussion involved asking the men in the audience some tough questions about why they didn't speak up when they see sexual harassment happening. As Angel Garcia put it, everyone had a role to play in preventing sexual harassment, and speaking up for someone else was also within their power. That training is part of a larger effort known as the Fair Food Program, which requires farms to abide by a strict code of conduct, including zero tolerance for sexual harassment. And in order to sell to fair food purveyors like Whole Foods, McDonald's, and Trader Joe's, they must abide by that code of conduct. But it's not just a code of conduct on paper. Workers are trained on their rights and they become the eyes and ears of the program. The program also sends auditors into the fields to do unannounced visits. If there's a problem with sexual harassment, there are consequences. A supervisor who engages in physical sexual harassment, for example, is banned from a fair food farm for up to 2 years. Because workers created and continue to drive this program, and because there are real consequences for bad behavior, the workers report that this program has, for the most part, eliminated extreme sexual harassment in the tomato fields of Florida. The program has since been expanded to operations in Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and New Jersey, and to pepper and strawberry crops in Florida. Dairy workers in Vermont have also launched the Milk with Dignity program based on the Fair Food model. Florida's farm workers and California's janitors may seem like wildly different industries operating in vastly different spaces, but both have adopted similar approaches to addressing sexual harassment. They have identified strategies that respond to the specific economic and practical realities of their industries. They deployed a popular education model to make sure training reaches all workers. And in the process, they've made it clear that bad behavior is not tolerated and that it will be met with consequences. They've also involved workers in seeking ways to prevent sexual harassment, not just respond to it. As Guadalupe Aguayo, a janitorial workplace investigator, summed it up for me recently, the workers are the experts. They know best what happens on the job. That's why it's important to involve everyone who knows these problems firsthand. Finally, I have a few more words to say about Me Too. I'm glad that Me Too has brought so much attention and energy to this issue. I continue to feel a sense of urgency in wanting to bring these stories and cases to light. But I also believe that while we need to continue to make a space and make it easier for people to talk about sexual violence if they want to, saying Me Too is not the point. This gets at a larger, unanswered question that I struggled with while writing this book, and which I continue to grapple with as a reporter who covers sexual violence. What should justice look like for women who have been sexually abused? It's an especially weighted question for the women I've been talking about because they, along with the hard work that they're doing, have been overlooked and undervalued. What does justice look like for those not deemed worthy of it? Meanwhile, conventional notions of justice tend to focus on seeking recourse through the legal system or by filing a complaint with an employer. But I have met too many women who were dissatisfied with the results when they took the difficult step to come forward. I'm not dismissing these approaches. There is clear value to the current laws and policies prohibiting sexual harassment at work because they establish norms and standards. They convey a sense of rights and expectations. And as with Georgina and so many other workers, I have personally seen how, in fighting for new laws or taking their cases to court, they come to feel empowered to demand dignified workplaces and respect in their jobs. I have seen them become leaders in their communities and workplaces. But ultimately, concepts of justice are incredibly individual, and some harassed workers have told me that justice to them is the ability to publicly confront their perpetrator. Some wanted their harassers fired. Others wanted prison time for their rapists. And others said that justice simply meant an end to their harassment so that they could go back to work in peace. And still others said that they began to feel a sense of justice when they realized that they had been believed. No single system of justice can deliver justice universally. So that's why I have been interested in efforts that look to prevention, that seemingly pie-in-the-sky idea tied to changing workplace behavior and attitudes. But prevention is not as abstract as it might initially sound. We are seeing efforts to get underneath this problem before it begins, from California's janitors and Florida's farm workers. And in the end, while justice can mean many things to many people, I think that when it comes to sexual violence, we ought to consider that justice is actually the absence of the transgression happening in the first place. But when we continue to rely on conventional ideas of justice by solely pursuing cases through the legal system or company bureaucracies, victims are asked to seek recourse for a violent act that they have already been forced to experience, endure, and survive. For these women, as resilient as they have proven themselves to be, any semblance of justice comes too late. Instead, there's much more to explore as individuals and also as journalists when it comes to preventing sexual violence so that more women and workers can avoid harm when all they're simply trying to do is an honest day's work. Thank you so much.
So, thank you, Bernice. I told you that this would be an important conversation, and I know that it will spur further thought, hopefully long after you leave here tonight. We always open up for questions. I think we have a microphone somewhere. Yes. Kath?
Hello, I read your book. I thought it was really well written. Without hyperbole, you let these awful facts speak for themselves. But there was something that attracted my attention in the first couple of pages, because it's something that I think will resonate with many journalists. A colleague of yours said he didn't think many newsrooms would want to tell this story. I wondered why you think that is and what you think needs to change.
That's such a great point, and I think that was one of the initial challenges to this project and to the initial reporting that we were doing was that this journalism student had come across this terrible phenomenon, and yet she couldn't get any editors or producers to buy in and to expend the resources in order to do this story. I think the feeling at that time was, is this a population that we really care about? How will it resonate with our readership, our audience? And I think, frankly, the only solution to that is to go ahead and plant your flag in the ground and do it. I think some of my colleagues from that project Lowell Bergman, the veteran journalist, that's essentially what he said. We're going to plant our flag in the ground and we're going to do this story anyway. And sometimes you just have to lead by example. You have to show the naysayers what the story can be. And I think, there are also lots of practical considerations around why this story wasn't done. It was challenging in terms of getting people to come forward, obviously, and it did involve a great expenditure of resources. There were 5 news organizations in the end that worked together in order to make this happen, and we had to pool our resources. And the biggest resource was our time. I mean, it took 13 months for the first project and 18 months for the second, because of this long, slow dance that you have to do in order to develop the trust with sources, in order to show their faces on camera and use their voices on radio and use their names and the details of their lives in text stories. So I know it's a hard thing to consider, but I think sometimes the story trumps all, and if you have a good story and you can figure out a way to plant your flag, then plant your flag.
Is there any evidence that would show that the perpetrators of these acts share information with each other, and that some of the people that are abused go through kind of a system of abuse?
I think what's interesting is that this modus operandi of farm worker supervisors who lure farm workers into their trucks to move them from one place to another, or even sometimes in a food processing plant from one part of the factory to another, and use that time in the truck as a space to harass and assault. The fact that we saw it in Iowa, Washington, California, I think, I don't know how these communications are happening, but clearly the message has gone out that this is a way to go about this behavior, to the point actually where it's so well known that some farms prohibit their supervisors from allowing supervisors from driving their workers in their trucks. And then in terms of systems or kind of experiences with abuse, I think that's a really critical point. A lot of women are like somebody like Georgina, who already had a history of abuse and violence in their lives. Sometimes there's some abuse and violence that happens while they're crossing the border. And some women have said to us, well, we've already endured some really terrible things at home, at the border, and then this happens at work, and you kind of begin to believe that this is normalized behavior. And really, the part of that Promotora program I was talking about, what was really earth-shattering is the message that they were sending, that this is not normal, that this is not acceptable, and that this is actually something that is illegal in this country.
Did you find that the women spoke about their experiences with each other, or did they try to warn new women as they came to be employed there, or was this something that they kept to themselves, which understandably women may be afraid of losing everything, losing their jobs, etc. But what was their relationship like?
Part of the issue, especially on the janitorial level, is that they were so isolated, working on separate floors, working in individual bank branches, that there wasn't an opportunity to kind of do that kind of whisper network. Information sharing. On the farm, where there were kind of larger worker populations, you did find people talking amongst each other. Certain people would develop certain reputations. People would say, try to avoid this person, and there would be information sharing in that way. But, ultimately, when the boss says get in the truck, you get in the truck.
Thanks, Bernice. Welcome back to Ann Arbor. I really appreciated your comments there at the end about the Me Too movement, and it isn't just about justice, it's about prevention. and that at the end of the day, we need a cultural change here in our society. And I'm wondering, thinking about you're talking about solutions. Have you seen progress on that front? Men taking the lead, industries, employers, to bring about a real cultural change right now?
I think some of the organizations that I highlighted, like the Fair Food Program, they're some of the most kind of sophisticated and developed. But there's also organizations like the Good Men Project. There's the Green Dot Program, which is really advocating for bystander intervention and kind of the work of allies and others to really step in to kind of disrupt harassing dynamics. So I think there is a lot that's out there that's being tried and experimented with that's looking very promising.
If I could build on that question, do you have any stories of, these women have men in their lives who are angry at this happening. Have you have any stories of illegal vigilante actions against these harassers?
That's such an important question because, again, one of the many, many factors for so many of these women about why they don't say something, in addition to the raft of reasons that I discussed in the talk, is that they didn't want to upset their partners sometimes because they were concerned about vigilante justice and violence. We did talk to a husband and wife where, unfortunately, this was a night shift janitor in Minnesota, and when she told her husband what happened, he literally took a knife and was planning to do something about it, but then did some soul searching and realized that that wasn't going to be the result he was looking for. But I think, that is certainly a dynamic on a lot of the female workers' minds, and a big concern when they're thinking about how to seek help, whether to say anything. Fortunately, I do not personally know of any incidents of that kind, but certainly some close calls.
So, hi, Bernice.
Hi.
I'm a big admirer of your work and of the book, and so thank you for the lecture. I have a question about process, and it's obvious that you talked to many more women than the ones who actually eventually ended up in the reporting and in the book. So there's this process of gaining trust, and you're working with communities that are so culturally specific. So how important was your awareness of that cultural specificity, and also with dealing with victims of trauma and being aware of that as well?
Mm-hmm. I don't think it hurt us at all, and I think it was a huge advantage that the core reporting team on this project was made up primarily of people who come from immigrant backgrounds. I'm certainly not one of the journalists who thinks that you have to only write about one specific thing, you have to write about your background or only what you know. I think the beauty of journalism is the exploration and the learning. But I think that sometimes your background can be a resource, and I think having, my Spanish, as you know, is really functional, and it can, I was the Spanish language learner of the group. The rest of the team was fully bilingual, and I think there was something really powerful about not having to do translation back and forth in really kind of touchy, sensitive conversations. And I know that cannot always happen, but I think it was an advantage for us. So I think that was really, really important component. But I think more than anything else, it was taking the time. I think we never went in saying, will you give us an interview? It was, let us introduce you to us, see how you feel about us and interacting with us. See if you are interested in this project that we're working on. We would like you to participate. And then from there, it became that long, slow dance of lots of conversations by phone and text message about everything else but kind of the deep, dark subject at hand, so that it got to the point where people felt comfortable sharing some of this, over time. And I think the most critical thing that I learned about covering vulnerable populations, and especially people who have been traumatized, especially by sexual violence, is that the crime itself involves a complete stripping of agency from that person. And so to be a journalist, to waltz in or parachute in and then engage in that same kind of behavior is the last thing that you want to do in order to be effective. So I think we really learned that that part of the building trust was giving them a sense of agency as to how their story is told. I mean, there's a fine line because obviously as journalists, we want to tell the stories through the lens that we see them. We want to call things as we see them. But I think there's also space to say that this is your story and this doesn't give us the right as journalists to just simply ride roughshod over your life and your trauma. I think that balance can be really artfully struck, and I think it's about just being aware that line exists.
Hi. So as a writer who is also a woman, I'm sure that you've received a lot of nonsense in your inbox in response to anything you've ever written. And so now that you've been doing this work, I wonder, how do you manage your own self-care after this book has been published?
I think I was very, very lucky to have worked in teams on all of these projects, and so it was always so helpful and reviving to have people to decompress with and to talk to after some especially upsetting or difficult interviews or material that we'd unearthed. So having kind of built-in comrades in arms to kind of discuss and unpack some of that emotional content was really, really helpful. But I've also been thinking a lot about, as Lynette mentioned, I really needed this fellowship to kind of give myself some time to think about what more I had to say, but also how I was going to go ahead and forge ahead on this same topic that I had been sitting with for too long, probably. Did I have the emotional energy to keep going on it? And I think in the end, what really helped was sticking with the story, always kind of finding my way back to the woman's story or a woman's story, because I know that it's not true for everybody, and for so many people, their process is very different. But many of the women that we were able to come in contact with were at a point in their healing and their recovery where they were really becoming leaders in their communities, and they were becoming really outspoken about this issue. And to see that kind of resilience within individuals and really focusing on that transformation, I think is what really helped me push forward on some really uncomfortable and challenging material.
We'll take one more question. I saw another hand.
Hi, Bernice.
Hi, Will. My
Thank
fellow
you.
fellow.
And, I think your work kind of embodies the best of what investigative journalism aspires to do. And my question is a little bit broader of what you think is needed for more of that type of reporting to happen as local newsroom budgets and local newspapers are in decline. You know the drill of everything going on in the industry. So I guess your thoughts either as us in the craft or in the industry or as consumers, however you see fit.
Support your local newspapers and subscribe and donate to your local nonprofit news organizations. No, but in all seriousness, seriously do that. But in addition, I think what was really critical about these stories and how they came together was really the collaborative nature of it. Again, as I said, there were 5 news organizations pooling their resources together, aware that one organization by itself would not have the time and resources to do it on its own. And that required us to really adopt a slightly different mindset. This concept of sharing and being out in the field all together, multi-platform, sharing your contacts and your sources, and really trusting another news organization and your colleagues, that was something we had to learn. But I think the results were were positive. I think it allowed us to do something that none of us could have done on our own. I think that, again, having the time to develop these relationships, even if it's not the only thing that you're working on, my entreaty to editors, I guess, would be give your reporters some time to develop these relationships, even if you do want them to be working on other things. Understand that these types of relationships are delicate, and have the patience to allow your reporters to know and to know best how to develop these relationships, and give them the time to do so. Because I think, it's a 24-hour cycle now. It's a rarity to have this much time, but I think really at the end of the day, that's the most precious resource for telling stories of people who are vulnerable and who just, aren't going to step forward immediately. You got to do that digging.
Thank you all for the questions. And for those of you who didn't get to ask a question or are still forming a question in your mind, one of the reasons we hold receptions after these events is that we want you to stick around and talk to one another, to talk to our speaker, to talk to our fellows, and talk to each other and explore some of the topics that came up. And Bernice, one of the traditions of this event is that we present you with a keepsake. I've asked every year why a bowl, and I don't know if Charles has ever given me a good answer, but this is the Hovey bowl. Wow. And we're proud to present it to you, and there's a really esteemed group of journalists who also have one of these. So thank you for coming. And this plaque hangs just inside the door at Wallace House, and fellows walk by it all the time and may not know what they're looking at, but this is the name of all of our returned fellows who have given Hovey lectures over the years, and you can see your name is already added to the plaque. Bernice Yeung, 2018-19 Hovey speaker. So thank you so much for coming back.
Thank you. This is amazing. Best homecoming I could imagine.
So, and if you talk to Bernice afterwards, she'll tell you that I actually invited her many months ago to come. And I've had the good fortune since I've been in this role as director that a light just goes off one day and I know who needs to come, not who I want to come, who needs to come as the Hovey speaker. And for those of you who were here 2 years ago when Molly Ball was here, and we were on the heels of the election, it was apparent that Molly Ball should be the Hovey speaker that year, and last year with Alec McGillis. And as things started erupting with the Me Too movement last year, and we started seeing so many stars in the news, and I had been so moved by Bernice's reporting, it was apparent that she was the person who needed to come. And so I'm just really thankful that we were able to give you this platform. And I will say, I'll repeat this, I said it last year at this event. Some of you have been to several of our Wallace House events. You know that we are taking a more active, visible role on campus and trying to convene conversations with different audiences. For me, as happy as I am to see all of you, this event, especially an event where we are talking about immigrant women and women of color, when I look out into the audience, I want to know that we're reaching the people who need to hear Bernice and need to hear her support and her commitment to their issue. And I challenged you all last year to bring someone to this lecture with you again who wouldn't necessarily be in this audience. We had some events last year, most notably at Rackham when we sponsored the live show of 1A with Joshua Johnson that was filled with college students, filled with people of color, filled with young activists, filled with people with different views, and we had a really robust conversation. And as I think through how we extend our welcome As beautiful as our gardens are here, sometimes I worry that people are afraid to come here. And so we have to invite them. We have to reach out to them and say, this is a space for you. The work of journalists is work that is being done for you, and we want to engage you in those conversations. So I would issue this challenge to you again. We have plenty enough chairs to accommodate overflow seating, and I would love to see this audience be more colorful next year. And I also want to invite you to join us throughout the year as we continue our Wallace House Presents series. We, as we did last year, will be exploring some themes across the academic year that are really central to the debates happening in our country now, politically, socially, economically. Our next event is on September 18th. No, it's not. That's today. Yes, is on October 9th. Where we'll be taking this discussion about immigration and shifting it in a slightly different direction, crisis at the border, shifting policy in a country of immigrants. Maria Elena Salinas, who is one of our Livingston Awards judges and is an icon of the news industry, a longtime host on Univision, and a role model to so many journalists, will be here moderating. We'll have Ginger Thompson from ProPublica, Aaron Nelson, our fellow who you met earlier who covers border issues, and Ann Lynn from the Ford School to look at the zero tolerance policy, what led up to it, how it crosses administrations, and where we go from here. I know it will be a really important, difficult, uncomfortable discussion, and I hope to see you all there. In January, we bring every year one of our Livingston Award winners back to campus to engage with us here. We do this event in partnership with the Ford School every year. Christina Goldbaum, who was our Livingston Award winner for international reporting last year, will be coming to talk about U.S. military and counterterrorism in Africa. Is anybody watching? That's also going to be at the Ford School at the Annenberg Auditorium. And in March, on March 19th, we'll be following up this conversation with the other side of this issue, the Me Too movement that we've spoken about several times. Ronan Farrow is coming to campus, along with Ken Aletta from The New Yorker, and we'll be talking about the Weinstein effect, breaking the stories that spurred the Me Too movement. I know that that will be a really interesting discussion, and I'd like for you to bring a lot of people to that one. And then Charles mentioned that in the same way that he created this event to honor Graham Hovey, we now have the Eisendrath Lecture as our capstone event at the end of our academic year to honor Charles and all that he built with this program. Charles was especially committed over the years to international news and really baked a real commitment to international journalism into the DNA of this program. And so the Eisendrath Symposium always deals with an issue related to international journalism. And we're going to be featuring some of this year's Knight-Wallace Fellows in a conversation about the threat to global press freedom. And if you're questioning that, I can tell you there is a threat, a very serious threat, not just here at home, but around the world. And it's something, a conversation that we want to engage you in. So with that, I will thank you all for coming, and I look forward to seeing you again. The bar is open, and please stay and talk. Thank you.